At 0600 hours on August 17, 1944, Major Hans-Ulrich von Luck stood inside the command post of Kampfgruppe von Luck near the village of Trun in Normandy, France, listening to sounds that meant death was descending from the sky. The noise was unmistakable, not the distant rumble of artillery or the sharp crack of rifle fire, but the rising whistle of diving aircraft followed by the rapid hammering burst of .50 caliber machine guns. The Americans called them Thunderbolts. The Germans had another name, Jabo, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber. And when the Jabos arrived, men died. Von Luck was 33 years old, commander of Panzergrenadier Regiment 125 of the 21st Panzer Division. He had fought in Poland, France, North Africa, and Russia before arriving in Normandy. Now his battle group was tasked with keeping the western end of the Falaise pocket open so that trapped German forces could escape. 50,000 German soldiers were surrounded on three sides, with only a narrow corridor remaining, one that von Luck's men were desperately struggling to hold. The Panther tanks and assault guns under von Luck's command were supposed to be among the finest armored vehicles in the world. Their sloped armor could deflect most Allied shells. Their 75mm main guns could destroy a Sherman at 2,000 meters. They possessed superior optics and excellent mobility. German tank crews knew their Panthers and Tigers could defeat almost any American or British armor in direct ground combat. But none of that mattered when the Jabos appeared. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a massive single-engine fighter, one of the heaviest fighters of the war. Fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and ordnance, it weighed 17,500 pounds, nearly 8 tons. It was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine, an 18-cylinder, air-cooled powerhouse producing 2,000 horsepower. This enormous engine drove a four-bladed Curtiss electric constant-speed propeller 13 feet in diameter. The P-47's primary armament consisted of 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing outboard of the landing gear. Each gun carried between 300 and 425 rounds, giving the aircraft a total ammunition load of roughly 3,400 rounds. When all 8 guns fired together, the Thunderbolt could deliver a weight of fire exceeding 100 pounds per second. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds could penetrate light armor, ignite fuel tanks, and tear apart soft-skinned vehicles. In addition to its machine guns, the P-47 could carry external ordnance on hardpoints beneath the fuselage and wings. A centerline rack could mount a single 500-pound bomb or a 300-gallon drop tank for extended range missions. Wing racks allowed additional bombs, bringing the total bomb load to 2 500-pound weapons. Alternatively, the aircraft could be equipped with 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, known as VARs. These rockets carried a 7.6-pound TNT general-purpose warhead and were highly effective against vehicles, buildings, and personnel. The Thunderbolt's most extraordinary trait was its ability to absorb punishment and keep flying. Its radial engine, unlike liquid-cooled inline engines, could lose multiple cylinders to combat damage and still continue operating. The airframe was built with heavy structural members and thick aluminum skin. Armor plate shielded the pilot from both front and rear. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, meaning bullet holes would close automatically to prevent catastrophic fuel loss. P-47 pilots routinely returned to base with extensive battle damage. Aircraft came back riddled with holes through wings, fuselage, and tail surfaces. Some returned with entire cylinders blown off the engine. Others landed with control surfaces partially destroyed. Among pilots, the Thunderbolt earned a reputation as the aircraft most likely to bring its pilot home alive after taking enemy fire. But in August 1944, the P-47's greatest tactical advantage was neither its durability nor its firepower. It was the fact that the Americans enjoyed complete air supremacy over Normandy. The Luftwaffe had been driven from the skies. German tanks moved in daylight at extreme risk. Allied fighter bombers ruled the air, and the Germans were learning what it meant to be hunted from above. The tactical dilemma facing German armored forces in Normandy was unprecedented in modern warfare. Since June 6, D-Day, Allied aircraft had attacked German formations with relentless intensity. British Typhoons armed with 20mm cannons and rockets. American P-47s with .50 caliber machine guns and bombs. P-38 Lightnings carrying cannons and machine guns. The strikes came in waves throughout daylight hours, especially in clear weather, turning roads into killing zones and forcing German units to move only at night or under heavy fog. Official Luftwaffe intelligence reports from early July 1944 recorded that Allied fighter bombers were flying between 2,000 and 3,000 sorties per day over the Normandy battlefield. German units attempting to move toward the front during daylight were losing 10 to 15% of their vehicles before reaching their assembly areas. Tank columns reported being attacked every 20 to 30 minutes whenever weather allowed flight operations. The operational impact was devastating. German armored divisions that should have been able to advance 50 to 80 kilometers per day were reduced to moving only at night. Covering perhaps 20 kilometers before dawn forced them back into concealment. Units dispersed into small groups, hiding in woods or villages during daylight hours. Camouflage netting became more valuable than ammunition. Commanders planned movements around weather forecasts, praying for clouds and rain that would ground Allied aircraft. The psychological impact exceeded the physical damage. German soldiers throughout Normandy coined a term that captured their terror: Jagdbomber, death by fighter bomber. It became the most feared way to die in the campaign. Not tank-on-tank combat, where training and skill mattered. Not infantry assaults, where individual courage could influence the outcome. But helpless on a road, repeatedly strafed from above, unable to fight back, watching comrades burn inside vehicles that had become steel coffins. Field Marshal Owen Rommel, perhaps Germany's most respected armored warfare commander, grasped this reality from the earliest days of the Normandy campaign. On June 10, 1944, just 4 days after D-Day, Rommel sent a blunt assessment to his superiors at the Wehrmacht High Command. The enemy's air superiority has a very grave effect on our movements. There is simply no answer to it. Every movement of our troops by day is subject to air attack from fighter bombers. The enemy has complete command of the air over the battle area up to about 100 kilometers behind the front. Rommel's judgment was neither pessimism nor defeatism. It was accurate tactical analysis from Germany's most experienced field commander. He had fought Allied air power in North Africa. He understood what air supremacy meant for ground operations, and he knew that without control of the sky, German armored forces could not conduct the mobile warfare that had brought victory in Poland, France, and the early campaigns in Russia. 2 months later, on July 17, 1944, Rommel himself became a casualty of Allied air supremacy. Returning from an inspection of the front lines, his staff car was spotted by British Spitfires of No. 602 Squadron, Royal Air Force. The fighters dove and strafed the vehicle on a road near St. Foy de Montgomery. Machine gun fire struck the car and the road surface, causing the driver to lose control. The vehicle crashed. Rommel, not wearing a seatbelt, was thrown from the car onto the roadway. He suffered 3 skull fractures, a fractured left temple and cheekbone, and severe damage to his left eye. Rommel never returned to Normandy. He spent weeks recovering in a German hospital. In October 1944, after being implicated in the July 20 plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler, he was forced to commit suicide by taking cyanide. The official Nazi announcement claimed he had died from his injuries, but Allied air power had already removed Germany's most capable field commander from the Normandy battlefield months before his death. Rommel was not the only German general killed or wounded by Allied aircraft during the campaign. Between June 6 and June 18, 1944, 3 German division commanders died in air attacks, a rate of senior leadership casualties unprecedented in modern warfare. General Erich Marx, commander of 84 Corps and one of the Wehrmacht's most experienced defensive specialists, was killed by fighter-bomber attack on June 12, 1944, just 6 days into the campaign. He had been instrumental in organizing the initial German response to the invasion. General Heinz Helmich, commander of the 243rd Infantry Division, died in an air attack on June 17, 1944. His division had been attempting to move toward the front when Allied aircraft struck the column. General Rudolf Stegmann, commanding the 77th Infantry Division, was killed by strafing aircraft on June 18, 1944, as his unit attempted to reinforce defensive positions near the invasion beaches. These were not chance casualties from random encounters. They were the result of systematic Allied air operations designed to paralyze German command and control. Fighter bombers hunted for staff cars, command vehicles, and radio antennas that indicated headquarters locations. The psychological effect on surviving German commanders was profound. They knew that movement during daylight hours invited death from above, regardless of rank or position. Death at the hands of Allied fighter bombers had become so common among German forces that soldiers created their own grim terminology: Jabo, Todd, death by Jabo. It was a fate that generals and privates shared equally. Rank provided no protection from 850 caliber machine guns firing from a diving Thunderbolt. Hans von Luck's 21st Panzer Division had been engaged in continuous combat operations since the first day of the invasion. The division held the unique distinction of being the only German panzer unit to reach the invasion beaches on June 6, launching a counterattack against British forces advancing from Sword Beach toward Cologne. Since that first day, the 21st Panzer had fought in every major defensive battle around Cologne, suffering continuous attrition from both Allied ground forces.
and the unrelenting air attacks.
The division had fought at Villers-Bocage, where Michael Whitman's Tiger tank had briefly halted a British armoured column.
It had defended against Operation Goodwood in July. The massive British
armoured offensive preceded by the heaviest aerial bombardment of the campaign.
Funluck's battle group had held
critical positions on the Bruce Ridge, using terrain and prepared defences to blunt British attacks despite being
heavily outnumbered. But even successful defensive battles took their toll. By
early August 1944, the 21st Panzer Division had lost most of its original tanks and vehicles. What remained was an improvised mixture of surviving German equipment, captured French tanks and half-tracks, and field modifications
created by the division's ingenious engineer, Major Alfred Becker.
Becker had converted obsolete French armor into assault guns and armored personnel carriers, creating functional fighting vehicles from equipment that would otherwise have been useless.
The
division soldiers called their collection of vehicles Rammelcircus because of the mighty assortment of German,
French, and hybrid equipment.
Some units operated Panther tanks alongside French Hotchkiss tanks mounting German guns. Infantry rode, and a mixture of German half-tracks and converted French vehicles. The division's maintenance crews performed miracles, keeping this
diverse fleet operational under combat conditions with limited spare parts. Funluck's CONF Gruppe, his battle group,
consisted of approximately 40 tanks and assault guns in mid-August, along with the 2 infantry battalions of his 125th
Panzer Grenadier Regiment.
These forces were operating as part of a desperate attempt to prevent the complete
encirclement and destruction of German forces in Normandy. American forces under Lieutenant General George Patton
had broken through German defenses at Ranches at the end of July and were racing east and north in a sweeping
movement.
British and Canadian forces were pushing south from K.
The trap was closing around 5 German divisions. Encirclement meant annihilation. German commanders knew they needed to withdraw immediately or face complete destruction. But Adolf Hitler had forbidden any retreat. Instead, he
ordered an immediate counterattack, Operation Ludick, an armored thrust toward a branches designed to cut off Patton's supply lines and restore the German defensive front.
The counterattack was launched on August 7, 1944.
It failed catastrophically within 48 hours.
The primary reason for the failure was not superior American tactics or overwhelming force. It was Allied air power.
On August 8, weather over Normandy cleared after several days of clouds and rain that had grounded
most air operations. Allied commanders immediately launched every available aircraft. Over 3,000 sorties were flown that single day. P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons fell on German armored columns attempting to advance toward the branches and later trying to withdraw from the failed attack. The attacks were coordinated through a sophisticated ground-air cooperation system, forward air controllers with the advancing
American ground forces radioed target coordinates to aircraft circling overhead.
Fighter bombers dove on German
positions, expended their ammunition and bombs, returned to forward airfields in Normandy to rearm and refuel, then
returned to strike again. Some pilots flew 4 or 5 missions in a single day. The devastation was extraordinary.
Panzerlehr Division, one of the elite German armored formations, lost over 70% of its tanks and vehicles in a 48-hour period. The division effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Survivors described roads littered with burning vehicles, dead horses, and bodies. The division commander reported that his unit had been destroyed not by American ground forces but by unrelenting air attacks that made movement impossible and concentration suicidal. The failed counterattack and subsequent airstrikes created the conditions for the Falaise Pocket,
the
encirclement that would destroy German combat power in Normandy.
Canadian forces pushing south from K and American
forces sweeping north from the Avanched breakout threatened to trap 5 German divisions in a shrinking pocket near the
town of Falls. German commanders recognized the danger and began a fighting withdrawal, attempting to
escape eastward before the trap closed completely, but the withdrawal had to be conducted during daylight hours because
The situation was deteriorating too rapidly to wait for nightfall. German units moved in daylight and paid a terrible price. This was the tactical situation that Hans von Luck faced on August 17, 1944. His CONF Gruppe had
been assigned the critical mission of holding open the western end of the escape corridor near the villages of Trun and Shamba. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers were trapped in the pocket.
Half of them, perhaps 25,000, might escape if the corridor could be kept open for several more days, but keeping it open meant accepting continuous punishment from Allied fighter bombers. Von Luck's forces held defensive positions on low ridges west of Trun. Canadian and Polish units were attacking from the north, trying to close the gap.
American forces were probing from the south and overhead throughout daylight hours. Allied
aircraft circled like predatory birds, diving on anything that moved. The experience of being attacked by fighter
bombers was described by von Luck and other German veterans as unlike any other combat they had experienced.
Tank crews could see enemy armor at distance and maneuver to favorable firing positions. Infantry could dig foxholes
and to create overhead cover against artillery, but fighter bombers gave almost no warning.
The first indication
was often the sound of diving engines, followed seconds later by the hammer of machine guns or the explosions of
rockets and bombs. German anti-aircraft defenses in Normandy by August 1944 had been reduced to a few self-propelled guns and some improvised mounts on vehicles. These weapons had some
deterrent effect, forcing Allied pilots to attack from higher altitudes or to approach from unexpected directions, but they could not prevent attacks.
Allied pilots learned to identify anti-aircraft positions and strike them first, then
attack the vehicles they were protecting. The psychological strain on German soldiers under constant air
attack was severe.
Men who had fought bravely in ground combat for years found themselves helpless against an enemy they could barely see and could not effectively engage. The sound of aircraft engines produced immediate
anxiety.
Clear weather, which soldiers normally welcomed, became a source of dread because it meant Allied aircraft
would be operating.
Some German units began moving only in very small groups, dispersing widely to reduce the
effectiveness of air attacks.
Others tried to move during twilight hours, the brief period after dawn or before dusk, when there was enough light to navigate, but Allied air operations were reduced. But these tactics only slowed the
inevitable.
As long as Allied aircraft controlled the sky, German ground forces were vulnerable.
On August 17, Flux
men held their positions through the day, fighting off probing attacks by Canadian forces while watching the sky
nervously. The weather was clear.
Allied aircraft were overhead almost continuously.
German vehicles attempting
to move through the corridor were attacked repeatedly.
The road east from Trum toward Vimutier was littered with destroyed vehicles and dead soldiers.
Von Luck later wrote in his memoir that the period from August 17 to August 21, when the corridor finally closed, was among the most difficult of his military career. His men held their positions, allowing thousands of German soldiers to escape, but the cost was high. Many of his tanks and assault guns
were destroyed by air attacks. Casualties among his infantry were severe, and the experience of those 5
days under constant threat from above demonstrated conclusively that armored forces without air cover could not
survive on a modern battlefield.
While German tank crews were learning this lesson in Normandy, the American pilots flying the P-47 Thunderbolts were gaining invaluable experience in close air support operations.
One of these pilots was 2nd Lieutenant Quentin Aninson from Lver, Minnesota, a small farming community near the South Dakota border. Aninson had been commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant on January 7, 1944.
After completing flight training, he
arrived in England in May 1944 and was assigned to the 391st Fighter Squadron of the 366th Fighter Group, one of the 9th Air Force tactical fighter groups assigned to support the invasion of France.
His first combat mission was
flown on June 6, 1944, D-Day itself. He took off from Thruxton, England, flew
his P-47 Thunderbolt across the English Channel, and dropped his bombs on German positions behind Point D Hoc in advance of the American forces landing on Omaha and Utah beaches. The mission was his introduction to combat and to the dangerous work of flying ground attack sorties against defended targets. 10 days later, on June 16, Ainson's Squadron relocated from England to a hastily constructed airfield in Normandy, operating from French soil while the campaign was still in its early stages. From this forward base, he and his squadron mates flew bombing and strafing missions almost daily, attacking German troops, vehicles, artillery positions, and supply dumps.
On July 25, 1944, an ensign participated in Operation Cobra, the American breakout offensive south of St. Lo. Over 3,000 Allied aircraft
participated in the operation, dropping thousands of tons of bombs on German defensive positions in a concentrated
area.
The bombardment was one of the heaviest airstrikes of the war, designed to shatter German defenses and create conditions for American armored forces to break through into open country.
The operation succeeded, but at a cost. Some bombs fell short, killing American soldiers in forward positions. An ensign and other pilots witnessed the
devastation caused by the bombardment and the desperate fighting as American ground forces exploited the
breakthrough. On August 3, 1944, an ensign experienced firsthand the
dangers of flying ground attack missions against defended targets.
He was on a mission over Vire, France, attacking German artillery positions when anti-aircraft fire struck his aircraft.
Flak fragments punctured his engine and
fuel tanks.
His cockpit caught fire. An ensign tried to bail out, but the canopy had been jammed by the battle
damage.
He was trapped in the burning cockpit. Facing the certainty of burning to death, he made a desperate decision. He pushed his Thunderbolt into a steep dive, accelerating toward the ground at maximum speed. The rush of air through the damaged airframe, combined with the change in air pressure, extinguished the cockpit fire.
An ensign managed to control the badly damaged aircraft and crash-landed at his forward airfield. The impact was severe. He suffered a
concussion, a dislocated shoulder, and burns to his hands and face.
The Thunderbolt was a total wreck, broken in half from the crash landing, but an ensign was alive.
The P-47's rugged construction and the pilot's skill had saved him.
After recovering from his injuries, an ensign returned to flying combat missions.
By the end of the war in May 1945, he had flown 75 combat missions
over France, Belgium, and Germany. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement in aerial
flight, the Air Medal with 9 oak leaf clusters for meritorious achievement during aerial flight, and the Purple
Heart for wounds received in action.
But an ensign was not famous.
Most Americans never heard of him during the war. His name did not appear in newspapers or popular books about aerial combat. He
was one of thousands of fighter-bomber pilots who did the grinding, dangerous, unglamorous work of close air support.
Without recognition or publicity,
the work was as dangerous as any aerials
combat. While high-altitude bomber escorts might encounter German fighters, ground attack pilots faced intense anti-aircraft fire on every mission. German flak units knew that Allied fighter bombers were their primary threat and concentrated their defenses accordingly.
Pilots flew into a wall of explosive shells and machine gun fire every time they attacked a defended
target. The psychological toll was severe, unlike bomber crews who flew at high altitude and might not see the results of their attacks clearly.
Fighter-bomber pilots saw exactly what their weapons did to enemy soldiers and vehicles. They saw men burning trying to escape from destroyed vehicles. They saw the impact of their bombs and rockets on
buildings and positions.
The experience of repeatedly killing at close range, even enemy combatants who were
legitimate military targets, affected many pilots profoundly.
An ensign later described the emotional and psychological impact of his combat experience.
He struggled with nightmares and intrusive memories for years after the war.
The images of men he had killed haunted him. He questioned whether the violence he had participated in was justified, even though intellectually he understood that defeating Nazi Germany required such actions. He struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why he had lived when so many of his friends and squadron mates had died.
After the war
ended, an ensign returned to Minnesota, married Jacqueline Greer, the girl he had written letters to every day from
England and France, and worked in the insurance industry for 40 years.
He rarely spoke about his combat experience. Like many veterans, he found it difficult to explain what he had experienced to people who had not been
In combat, the memories were painful, the emotions were complex, it was easier to remain silent. But in the early
1990s, nearly 50 years after the war, Aninson's adult children convinced him to document his story.
they wanted to
Understand what their father had experienced. They wanted to preserve his testimony for future generations.
Aninson agreed.
He gathered his photographs, his letters, and his memories and created a video documentary
titled A Fighter Pilot Story.
The documentary combined Aninson's personal photographs with archival footage from
the National Archives and other sources.
Aninson provided narration, reading from his wartime letters and describing his experiences in his own words. The result was one of the most powerful and honest first-hand accounts of what
American ground attack pilots experienced during World War II. The documentary aired on public television.
In 1994, the 50th anniversary of D-Day, it received wide acclaim for its honesty
and emotional power.
Unlike many World War II documentaries that focused on heroism and victory, A Fighter Pilot
Story showed the costs of war, the psychological damage, the moral ambiguity, and the lasting trauma that many combat veterans carried for decades after the fighting ended. In 2007,
documentary filmmaker Ken Burns featured Aninson's story in his epic 7-part series, The War, which told the story of World War II through the experiences of ordinary Americans from 4 towns.
Aninson's testimony about his combat
experiences, his relationship with his wife through letters, and his post-war struggles with trauma were central to
the series.
Millions of Americans heard his story through Burns's documentary. Aninson died on March 5, 2008 at the
age of 87.
He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His documentary, A Fighter Pilot Story, continued to be shown in schools, museums, and military training courses as an educational resource about
the realities of aerial combat and the psychological costs of war. The P-47
Thunderbolt flew its last combat missions in Europe in May 1945 as German forces surrendered.
By that time, over
15,000 Thunderbolts had been built, more than any other American fighter aircraft.
The aircraft had served in every theater where American forces fought, from Western Europe to Italy to the Pacific. Official Army Air Force statistical reports credited P-47 pilots with extraordinary achievements from D-Day through VE Day. The records showed
86,000 railroad cars destroyed, 9,000 locomotives knocked out, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles claimed, and 68,000 trucks destroyed. These were the official claims submitted by pilots and verified through gun camera footage and mission reports. Post-war historical analysis suggested that these numbers were significantly inflated due to multiple factors. Pilots attacking the same target often each claimed it as destroyed. Gun camera footage and the chaos of low-altitude attacks was frequently unclear. Disabled vehicles were sometimes counted as destroyed when they might have been reparable. And pilots, like all combatants, tended to assess damage optimistically under stressful combat conditions.
Modern historians estimate that actual
destructions were perhaps 40 to 60% of the claim totals. Even if the numbers are reduced by half, the impact on
German logistics and mobility was devastating. Thousands of vehicles actually were destroyed. Hundreds of trains were wrecked.
German units throughout France reported severe shortages of fuel, ammunition, and supplies because Allied air attacks had destroyed so much of the transportation infrastructure.
The fundamental lesson
from the P-47's combat record in Normandy was about combined arms warfare and the dominance of air power in modern
military operations.
German armored forces, despite having superior tanks, superior training and armored tactics, and years of combat experience, could not operate effectively under enemy air supremacy.
The tank had been the dominant weapon on European battlefields since the German blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 and 1940. Fast-moving armored
columns supported by close air support had conquered Poland, France, the Low Countries, Yugoslavia, Greece, and
penetrated deep into the Soviet Union.
German tactical doctrine emphasized mobility, concentration of force, and
Exploitation of breakthrough opportunities. These tactics required the ability to move rapidly and to
concentrate forces for decisive attacks. But in Normandy in 1944, Allied air supremacy made German mobile warfare impossible.
Tanks could not move during daylight without inviting attack. Concentrations of forces attracted immediate airstrikes. Supply columns were destroyed faster than they could deliver fuel and ammunition to forward units. The entire German operational system, which depended on mobility and
flexible response to changing tactical situations, was paralyzed by air power. This changed fundamentally how military theorists and planners thought about future wars.
After 1945, every major
military force in the world recognized that ground operations without air superiority were suicidal.
Enormous
resources were invested in developing anti-aircraft systems, from shoulder-fired missiles to sophisticated radar-guided surface-to-air missiles. Armies developed elaborate procedures for camouflage, concealment, dispersion, and
movement techniques designed to reduce vulnerability to air attack.
But the fundamental tactical reality remained
unchanged into the 21st century. Control of the air means control of the battlefield. Ground forces operating
without friendly air cover or effective air defenses face destruction from above. The lesson that German tank crews learned in Normandy in 1944 has been relearned in conflicts from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq to Ukraine.
For German
soldiers who fought in Normandy and survived, the lesson was learned at terrible cost.
Hans von Luck was among the survivors. His confra held the escape corridor open until August 21. When Canadian and Polish forces finally closed the gap near Chamba, von Luck's unit withdrew eastward with the remnants of other German formations.
He continued fighting through the retreat across France, the defense of the German border,
and the final battles inside Germany itself. Von Luck survived the war, was captured by Soviet forces and spent 5
years in Soviet captivity under harsh conditions.
He was released and returned to Germany in 1950. He worked in business and agriculture in post-war West Germany. In 1989, 44 years after
the war ended, he published his memoir Panzer Commander, written with the assistance of American historian Stephen Badzi. The book became one of the most respected German memoirs of World War II.
Unlike some German accounts that
minimized Wehrmacht involvement in Nazi crimes or portrayed German soldiers as victims,
Von Luck's memoir was notably honest about German responsibility and the nature of the war Germany had waged.
The book was valued by military historians and officers for its tactical insights and honest assessment of German
operations.
Von Luck devoted considerable portions of his memoir to discussing the impact of Allied air
power on German operations in Normandy.
He described in detail how the constant threat of air attack paralyzed movement, how German units learned to fear clear weather more than enemy ground forces, how the sound of aircraft engines became psychologically associated with helplessness and death. He argued that the decisive factor in the Normandy
campaign was not the quality of German versus Allied equipment, not the relative skill of soldiers, not even the
numerical superiority of Allied forces. The decisive factor was air superiority. Allied control of the air made it impossible for German forces to execute the mobile defensive operations that might have contained the invasion.
German armor, which should have been able to counterattack rapidly and defeat, was reduced to static defense and piecemeal commitment because movement attracted immediate air strikes.
Von Luck developed friendships with several of his former opponents after the war, including British officers he had fought against at Villers-Bocage and Goodwood. He participated in military history symposiums, gave lectures at military colleges in Germany and other NATO countries, and served as a consultant for historical documentaries about the Normandy campaign. He spoke frankly about German tactical mistakes, about the impact of Hitler's strategic decisions, and about the lessons that modern military should learn from the
campaign.
He emphasized repeatedly in these post-war discussions that armor without air cover is vulnerable to
destruction from above.
He used his own experiences in Normandy to illustrate how air superiority changes the fundamental dynamics of ground combat, and he argued that future military planners must understand that control of the air is the prerequisite for successful ground operations in modern warfare.
Von Luck died on August 1, 1997 at the age of 86.
His memoir remained in print and continued to be studied by military officers and historians as a valuable first-hand account of Wehrmacht armored operations and the Normandy campaign from the German perspective.
Both von Luck and an ensign, former enemies who never met
during the war, contributed in their different ways to historical understanding of what the air war over Normandy meant to those who fought it. Von Luck provided the perspective of German armed forces operating under Allied air supremacy, describing the psychological and tactical impact from the receiving end. Anninson provided the perspective of American pilots conducting ground attack operations, describing both the effectiveness of close air support and the psychological costs of repeatedly attacking enemy forces at close range. The P-47 Thunderbolt itself became a symbol of
American air power and industrial might during World War II. A few dozen examples survive today in museums and private collections around the world. Some are displayed as static exhibits carefully restored to represent specific aircraft that flew in combat. A handful are maintained in flying condition, appearing at airshows to demonstrate the sight and sound of this historic aircraft.
These surviving Thunderbolts serve as tangible reminders of what the aircraft accomplished during the war and of the pilots who flew them into combat day after day.
They represent a period
in aviation history when piston engine fighters reached their peak of development and effectiveness,
and they
embody the technical achievement of American industry, which designed, tested, and mass-produced over 15,000
examples of a complex high-performance aircraft in less than 4 years.
The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt in Normandy
is ultimately about the transformation of modern warfare that occurred during World War II. For centuries, battles had
been decided primarily by soldiers and equipment on the ground.
Naval power controlled the seas. But air power was a
new dimension, less than 40 years old when World War II began, and its role in warfare was still being defined through
trial and error.
Normandy demonstrated conclusively that air power had become the dominant factor in modern military
operations. Ground forces could still win tactical engagements through skill, courage, and superior equipment. But
without control of the air, ground forces could not sustain operations or achieve strategic objectives.
Armies
that lost air superiority found themselves unable to move, unable to concentrate forces, unable to conduct
the mobile operations that modern warfare required. German tank crews in Normandy learned this lesson the hard way. They had superior tanks in many respects.
The Panther and Tiger had better armor protection and more
powerful main guns than the Sherman. German tank crews had more training in armored tactics than their American opponents. Many German soldiers had years of combat experience from campaigns in Russia, North Africa, and Italy. By conventional measures of training, equipment, and experience, German armored forces in Normandy should have been able to contain the Allied invasion.
But when Allied fighter bombers controlled the skies above Normandy, none of those advantages
mattered. German armor could not move during daylight without inviting destruction. Units that attempted to move were attacked repeatedly until they stopped or were annihilated. The ability to maneuver, which is the essence of
armored warfare, was taken away from German tank units by Allied air power.
The term Jabo, death by fighter
bomber, captured perfectly the psychological impact of this new reality on German soldiers. It was death that came from above. Death against which ground forces had limited means of defense.
Death that could strike at any moment when weather permitted flight operations. German soldiers throughout the Normandy
campaign feared the Jabos more than they feared Allied tanks, more than they feared artillery, more than any other
weapon or threat they faced.
The sound of American radial engines became the sound of approaching death.
The whistle
of diving aircraft signaled the beginning of an attack. The hammer of 850 caliber machine guns meant rounds were impacting nearby, tearing through vehicles and bodies with equal ease. These sounds became psychologically
associated with helplessness and fear.
Even veteran soldiers who had fought bravely in ground combat for years found
themselves terrified by the sound of diving thunderbolts. That is the fundamental reason why German tank crews feared the P-47 Thunderbolt and the pilots who flew it. Not because the Thunderbolt was the most advanced fighter of its time, though it was certainly among the finest. Not because it carried the heaviest armament, though its 8.50 caliber machine guns and bomb load were formidable. Not even because of its legendary toughness, though the trait saved countless pilots' lives.
German tank crews feared the Thunderbolt because it symbolized Allied air supremacy. When Thunderbolts appeared overhead, German forces knew they were exposed, vulnerable, unable to maneuver, and unable to respond effectively against an enemy striking from above. The best they could do was take cover, disperse, and hope the assault would end quickly. There was no tactical workaround, no clever defensive positioning, no superior equipment that could negate the threat of aircraft attacking from above with near impunity. That psychological dominance, coupled with the physical devastation wrought by repeated daily strikes, shattered the Wehrmacht's ability to conduct mobile operations in France. German armored formations that had conquered much of Europe between 1939 and 1942 through speed, flexibility, and concentrated force were now reduced to hiding in forests during daylight and moving only under the cover of night. The hunter had become the hunted.
The dominant weapon system of the early war years had been rendered obsolete by a newer technology operating in a different domain.
This transformation in warfare, more than any single battle or tactical innovation, determined the outcome of the Normandy campaign. Allied forces triumphed not merely because they had greater numbers, though they did, and not solely because they enjoyed superior logistics. While Allied supply networks were far more capable than German systems, the primary reason for victory was control of the sky over the battlefield. That air dominance made it impossible for German forces to maneuver effectively, concentrate for counterattacks, or sustain defensive operations over time. The P-47 Thunderbolt, flown by pilots like Quentin and Ensign and thousands of others whose names are now largely forgotten, played a pivotal role in achieving that supremacy.
Its rugged airframe allowed it to endure heavy anti-aircraft fire and return pilots safely even with extensive battle damage.
Its 8.50 caliber machine guns were devastating against ground targets, from vehicles to buildings to personnel. Its ability to carry bombs and rockets provided versatility for striking a wide range of targets. Its long operational range enabled it to penetrate deep behind enemy lines, disrupting supply routes and striking objectives far from the front. Perhaps most crucially, the Thunderbolt was produced in vast quantities. Over 15,000 were built, with hundreds patrolling the skies over Normandy on any clear day. This constant aerial presence meant German forces rarely moved without being spotted and attacked. The psychological effect of knowing enemy aircraft were perpetually overhead, constantly watching, and ready to strike, was as demoralizing as the physical destruction they caused. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief of German forces in the West, provided one of the most concise assessments of the Normandy campaign during post-war interrogations. When asked what factors led to German defeat in France, he replied, "3 factors defeated us in the West, where I commanded. First, the unprecedented superiority of your air force, which made all daytime movement impossible.
Second, the lack of motor fuel.
Third, the systematic destruction of all railway communications, making it impossible to bring even a single train across the Rhine. This prevented the deployment of reserves, and it was foolish to attempt military operations in France under such conditions." Von Rundstedt's assessment, from one of Germany's most senior and experienced commanders, confirmed what von Luck and thousands of other German soldiers had experienced firsthand. Allied air superiority, embodied in aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt, was the decisive factor that defeated German forces in Normandy. Everything else, the numerical superiority of Allied ground forces, the quality of their equipment, the skill of their commanders, built upon the foundation of control of the air. The legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt and the Normandy air campaign extends far beyond World War II.
The lessons learned in that campaign shaped military doctrine for decades.
Every major armed force reorganized after 1945 to emphasize air power and integrated combined arms operations.
The United States Air Force became an independent branch, recognizing that air power was a distinct form of warfare requiring specialized organization and doctrine. Other nations followed suit, building formidable air forces and developing equipment and tactics for both offensive and defensive operations. Close air support techniques pioneered in Normandy became standard practice: forward air controllers, improved radio communications, and enhanced coordination between ground and air units. These innovations, first implemented in 1944,
formed the foundation of close air support operations in every subsequent conflict. The sight of aircraft striking enemy ground forces, which German soldiers in Normandy experienced as relentless and unstoppable, became routine for Allied ground troops in later wars. The P-47 itself continued flying long after World War II ended. Many were transferred to Allied air forces and some even saw combat in later conflicts. Eventually, they were retired as jet-powered fighters replaced piston-engine aircraft, but their influence persisted through the tactical lessons they imparted and the operational doctrines they validated. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories.
Each one matters. Each deserves to be remembered. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from.
Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here.
Thank you for watching, and thank you for preserving these stories.